Welcome back to another Deep podcast. I'm D,
And I'm Cast.
and in this episode, we're going to be talking about the removal of human loss or loss of life from war. So, there are a couple of terms in there that can be ambiguous. Life is one of them, depending on if you're using robots or not, but also war. So, I would say, Cast, how do you define war?
Um, a large feud between um
Nations?
between two nations. Yeah, I guess the term nation can be used here. And that is violent, um, and is being fought over something, whether that be land, resources, or some belief system.
Right. I don't think it necessarily has to be over a resource. That a war of extermination is another type of war where you just want to eliminate the other person because of their ideology or because you don't
Mhm.
like them. So,
So their beliefs, the belief system, is what it's
right. But
called.
even in that, you're assuming that it's violent, that there has to be some sort of violence taking place. Does it have to be violence against living people? Because you can be at war with someone, and let's say that you're just destroying crops, but intentionally not killing people. Now, granted, you destroying crops means that you're trying to starve them out, but you can act in a way that inhibits your enemy's ability to live the life that they want without actually physically harming them. So, is physical harm necessary in war?
I would say in the majority of cases, yes. There might be some edge cases, but when we think about war, we think about harm being done on one side or the other.
Okay, so direct harm. In which case, if we remove the loss of human life, does that mean that war technically isn't happening?
Um, no, because I think violence can happen. Violence directly against a person is one thing, but violence can happen towards a people or towards a nation, but it doesn't mean it's directly affecting them. So I would say burning their crops is still a violent action, and although you're not killing people directly, you are being violent against them, and in doing so, potentially starving them in the future.
So I think what we're getting at is that there are different levels of war. So for instance, a trade war is a type of war where you're
Hmm.
levying trade agreements or what's the word when you're not
Like a
levies.
tariff.
T- Tariffs is a good word for it, of changing how much you're willing to trade with a particular country, the resources, and also preventing other sanctions. That's the word. Where you're preventing trade from going through to a particular country or a particular area, it makes it more difficult for that country to function. So I think that a war would be any active, ongoing conflict that I think it's an ongoing, not just a single instance, not just a battle, but you are continuing to be in conflict of some sort with another group of people. Two
I
people cannot
mean,
go to war with each other.
yeah, and I would say even it doesn't need to be against a group of people. I mean, look at the Australian emu wars
Sure.
and or the drug war. It's not directly against people, but it is still a war nonetheless. And I mean, looking at a Star Trek future, is what is the definition of people?
That's true. So it's more between two, I guess, forms of life. A war would be multiple life entities, or well, not even necessarily. If you, for instance, with the Borg Collective, they're in a way one entity, one thinking being. So you can go to war with one thinking being, which means that, I guess, technically speaking, two people would be able to go to war with each other
Hmm.
in at least to some degree. But then again, how are we defining war? Is there a difference between a combative war and a trade war? Because I think that there is.
Yeah, I think that's where the distinction is drawn in of a trade war, where it's a type of war, but it is its own category versus a combative war or a war against a mindset or against a harmful
Mhm.
substance like drugs.
So
Um,
so I think for the purpose of this discussion, because we're talking about the removal of loss from war, we're not really talking about trade wars, because, or at least loss of life. That in a trade war, that doesn't really happen. Your your quality of life is maybe strained because you aren't getting as much food or as many amenities as you would like during the time of that trade war. But that's not really what we're talking about. I think what we're talking about is
Hmm.
more of the combative side. So if
Yeah,
you're
such as
engaged,
the war on Christmas. Very
sure.
combative.
Um, I'm thinking more along the lines of proxy wars and drone warfare. That
Hmm.
if you have warfare that you're willing to kill over or destroy over, that's very different than a trade war. So a
Hmm.
trade war, you're not destroying anything, you're just making it difficult to create things and exchange things. I think what we're talking about when we mean war is something where destruction is occurring, either of property or of life. And how does removing the life component of that change the war?
Yeah.
So for instance, if in the United States uses drones to carry out a lot of attacks against their enemies, so that removes some of the risk, which is going to change how you carry out your warfare. Um, and likewise, if you're trying to destroy resources, you're much more likely to destroy resources than you are to kill a person, because it only takes a certain level of motive to destroy resources, but it takes a much higher motive to kill a person, assuming that you have a first world ideology where the value of human life is inherent, and so you don't want to eliminate human life unless it's a last resort.
Yeah.
So I think the question that we posed at the very beginning could be better phrased as, how does war change when in a destructive setting when you're not destroying things that are alive?
Or you're using things that are not alive to do the destruction.
Correct. So, for instance, let's start off with the first step into this particular category. You have a war, and let's say one side has almost no risk of loss of life.
Hmm.
And I think the United States in the Middle East is a pretty good
Yeah.
example of that, because the soldiers
Yeah.
are risking their lives, and they are occasionally killed, but the rate at which they are killed compared to Al Qaeda, ISIS, um, the United States enemies, I think it's like 20 to 1.
Yeah. It's pretty massive, the difference, especially in the first Gulf War. The United States just ran in and uh, destroyed Iraq, and the amount of casualties on the Iraqi side versus the U.S. side was uh, vastly different.
On
Um,
the order of a factor of 10 different. If if the United States was a player in Call of
it
Duty, they
was
would be
it was
banned
very
for
different.
cheating.
It was much more than a factor of 10. There was an estimated 100,000 Iraqi soldiers killed during the conflict, whereas the United States had 383.
Okay, so that's like 2.5 orders of magnitude.
Hmm.
So when you're talking about a difference in orders of magnitude, the United States would be banned from video games for suspicion of cheating. So
Yeah.
in that case, it changes how you go into war, because if you can go into a war and say, I'll lose 300 people, but I can kill 100,000 people, that's an ideological war. And
Hmm.
when you have no loss of human life on your side, but you can gain ground in terms of your ideological um, dominance, eliminating individuals that have an opposing ideology increases your prevalence, or at least the
Hmm.
prevalence of your ideology on the world stage. And if you don't have to lose people in order to do that, you're much more likely to go to war. And I think that that's something that is dangerous in the sense that you're more likely to take an act of war if you know that you're not really going to be losing many people. But it's
Yeah.
been like that forever. If you, for
Hmm.
instance, the Romans had high confidence because they had the technology, they had the war tactics, so they were much more likely to go to war because they knew that these, when you go to a country that's more of just a very large tribe compared
Hmm.
to Rome, you can easily just mow through them and take over.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Which,
mean, thinking about the when the bow and arrow was first invented, suddenly you could take down enemies from afar, and you didn't need to get up and close and personal and putting yourself at risk. Extending that into cannons and guns, suddenly, if you were on the side with the guns and the other side didn't have anything, then you probably are not at very high risk of harm, whereas they are.
Right. The idea that a lot of wars that take place and have ever historically taken place, usually one side is going to have a benefit, or as soon as a new type of warfare emerges, the side that developed that type of warfare is going to just mop the floor with whoever they view as an enemy because they have a massive advantage. That's how it has
Yeah.
historically always been.
I mean, it doesn't
So,
even need to be a massive advantage at times. Sometimes a technological difference of 10 to 20 years can have a massive impact if one side is fighting with older technology, even by
mhm,
a little bit. So I'm thinking about the Korean War. Um, when the U.S. entered in, for the most part, they were sent with World War II technology, whereas the weapons and things supplied by the Soviets to North Korea were the latest stuff that the Soviets had been creating, and so the newest types of bullets were able to go right through the American armor that had been sent because it was all just World War II
mhm.
surplus stuff, and they weren't sending the best of the best.
Sure. So
So
it wasn't necessarily a completely new type of technology. They're still bullets,
mhm.
but an improvement on the current technology. So
Yeah.
whenever a country has an improvement on their current technology, it still gives them a pretty decent edge in the war if their enemy doesn't have that improvement.
Mhm.
So I guess again, kind of rewording the original question is, to what degree is an advantage unfair, or is there an advantage that is unfair? So, for instance,
Mhm.
if the next step and kind of what we're witnessing now is we can use drones to take out enemies, which means even if the drone gets shut down or shot down, the person operating it isn't going to get
Mhm.
killed, isn't even at risk. They can be halfway around the world and still be operating the drone. You'll have
Yeah.
latency issues, but you're not risking your life in doing it. So we can kill people with no risk of life or
Mhm.
very, very low risk of life.
Yeah. And so I don't think the question really is about whether or not it is fair, because ultimately becomes unfair when one side has an advantage. It doesn't matter how big that advantage is. And in some cases, it's going to be a smaller advantage or a
Mm-hmm.
much bigger advantage. But
Sure.
fairness is probably not the right question. I would say, is it ethical? At what point does an advantage become unethical?
And I think one of the problems with asking that kind of question of is it ethical to have a huge advantage over your enemy in a war situation is, if you're in a war situation where you're killing people, it means you are pushed to the point of what we view as extreme, where you're starting to decide that the only way to gain a foothold with my ideology versus their ideology is to be actively killing them and eliminating them. And when you're pushed to that degree, the ethics change. That
Hmm.
we're saying we're killing our enemy because they endanger our ethics. So when your ethical system is endangered by another ideology to such a degree that you have to eliminate them, then in some way you need to defend your ethical system. And any ethical system that wants to remain has to be able to protect itself. And when that ethical system is pushed to the point of needing to defend itself through loss of life, then yes, it is ethical to win the war by any means necessary. That being said, I think let's take, for example, the only times that a nuclear bomb has been used against people in war was by the U.S. in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Hmm.
That is, I think, a good example of uh, trying to say we have a superior advantage over you. We have a huge advantage over you
Yep.
from the Americans to the Japanese. And what the goal wasn't to use that weapon to completely eliminate the Japanese.
It
The goal
was.
was
It
to
was.
say this is a
Yeah.
hopeless war. Stop fighting it, and we can figure out what to do from there.
Yeah, because more lives would have been lost had the U.S. continued to use conventional warfare until things were settled.
Right. It would have been
And the
lost on
invasion,
both
yeah,
sides.
the invasion of the mainland was expected to have tens or even more times as many deaths as the bombings did, and um, that is it. Those are staggering numbers. So
Hmm.
thinking of it as doing something major to prevent an even larger loss of life is worth it to an
Hmm.
extent, I feel.
And
And
I
that
think
was
that
the US's argument there.
I think that along those lines of, is it ethical to do that? Within the American system of ethics at that time, we were saying, if we do this now, there will be a massive loss of life. If we don't do this now, we expect there to be a significantly larger loss of life on both sides. We want to limit the loss of life on both sides as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the ethical system was telling us. The morality, or our moral system, says we need to preserve lives on both
Mm-hmm.
sides and just make them understand that their ideology of go out and conquer other lands and squash whoever resists, that's not okay. But we can teach them that, show them that we're more powerful than them, so that they start being receptive to our ways as opposed to just eliminating them. I think that from
Mm-hmm.
within the American ethics system, that that move is what was deemed to be ethical, despite the fact that it was a large loss of life on the enemy side compared to a very small risk on the
Mm-hmm.
American side. Because it was, if the planes go down, okay, you lose 2 planes, as opposed
Right.
to if you succeed, you kill 100,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
And so
I
so
mean,
it's one of
ultimately, it's
those.
the trolley problem. Let's kill this 100,000 people to save a million lives.
Exactly. And again, with the question of, is it ethical, it depends on the system that you're in. If you're defending an ethical system that says we need to preserve lives, you can take lives if it means the preservation of
Mm-hmm.
additional lives. If you're coming at it from an extermination perspective, then saying, well, obviously we just want to exterminate them and not convert them, which means we need to kill all of them. So
Yeah.
the more effectively we can kill all of our enemies and reduce the loss of life on our side, we should use every possible means to preserve our own lives and destroy theirs. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
saying, is it ethical? It depends on the moral system that you're working in. If you're fighting a war of extermination, this is very ethical, like as in a using a weapon that has a high kill to death ratio of killing your enemy versus deaths on the part of your soldiers or your people. The higher kill death ratio, the type of weapon that you can use, the better, regardless of what ethical system you have. If you want to preserve life, end the war quickly, which means using better weapons. And if you want to just eliminate lives and exterminate your enemy, then
Mm-hmm.
end it quickly.
Yeah. I mean, that was definitely the case in with Hiroshima and Nagasaki and just the end of the Pacific portion of World War II. I mean, going back to the Gulf War example, I mean, the estimates of 100,000 Iraqi soldiers are definitely estimates. Some say 60 to 200,000, whereas the U.S. had pretty good statistics on their own casualties. But the war, the first Gulf War, lasted about 6 months, and if you're killing 100,000 people in 6 months and only losing less than 400,
Mm-hmm.
it's you're it's
It's a
a
huge
pretty big thing.
advantage,
Yeah.
but I think that there's, to an extent, having a fast war has benefits because it limits not just the number of people dead, but the quality of life during the war. If you have a war that goes on for 15 years, the quality of life of the people growing up, and like particularly children during those 15-year period, is going to change not just their quality of life but how they perceive living.
Hmm.
If you're growing up constantly being at war, you're going to think that that's the norm, and it's going to make you more likely to go to war in the future. On top of the fact that since a lot of the resources are going to be going towards supplying the war efforts, you're going to have a lower quality of life throughout that time. So having a faster war is good, but having a decisive victory means that the argument doesn't really have time to play out, particularly
So I was
on
actually
an
just looking up
ideological
this.
warfare.
Yeah, looking up the statistics. The U.S. didn't start their ground assault until the 24th of February, 1991.
Okay.
The war ended on the 28th of February, 1991.
So that's what, 2 months?
4 days.
Oh, sorry. So 4 days and tens of thousands dead.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a perfect example that if your enemy doesn't even get a chance to counterattack, they don't have a chance to say, this is how deeply we feel about a particular ideology. Now, saying that that's more valuable than a decisive victory is saying both sides should be able to express their full opinions in the act of war of, we feel so strongly that we will die for what we believe in. But if your enemy just wipes out half of your population, you're much more likely to be, well, there's no way we can win against that. So even though I would be willing to die, I would be dying for nothing. So I'm not going to. In which case you're focusing all of the loss on one side as opposed to distributed through the two sides and weakening both.
Yeah. So the difference between sending, where do you draw the line? Is it okay to send people in on a ground assault, knowing that there will be minimal casualties, but still casualties? Is that the same ethics as not sending anyone in on a ground assault and instead sending in a drone or some kind of automata or like some kind of robotic, fighter in their place to kill and do all of the damage controlled by people? And so you are basically changing minimal casualties to no casualties directly.
Right.
On your side.
And when you have a technological advantage to such a degree that you can say we have basically no risk in loss of life and our enemies will have massive losses of life, then it's a new form of survival of the fittest. If someone in the Stone Age was the first person to make a stone axe, they're going to have a huge advantage over someone that has a stick, because they're able to whack someone in the head with a stone as opposed to with a piece of wood. So you're much more likely to win that battle with low risk to yourself. If you were smart enough to put that stone and stick together to create an axe or a hammer of some sort, then you are more likely to survive against anything else that life throws at you, which means that in terms of the preservation of life, the survival of the fittest is important, because if you have the survival of the weakest, then you're more likely to die out while battling nature. If you have a moral structure or an ideology that leads you to have better technology to the point where you can wipe the floor with another ideology, you are the most likely to succeed in a battle against the neutral atrocities that come from nature. Like, nature doesn't care what your ideology is. A tsunami will kill Muslims and Christians alike, regardless of what their religion is. So if you have an ideology that leads to better technology, and you can use that technology to eliminate ideologies that don't have that technology and are not as able to cope with something that's trying to kill them, then to a degree, you almost, in a way, you have an obligation to eliminate those people. That if I'm able to control viruses, viral warfare is a good example. Let's say you want a pure race, and you have enough gene manipulation that you can create a virus that kills everyone except for a particular race. You may view it from within that ethical system that it's your duty to eliminate everyone else, because you have such technology that you can now protect against viral attacks. If a viral attack is incoming, you have the technology to protect against it, which means you're better able to defend yourself against nature, which means that you are the most likely to survive, and you should start, I guess, culling the rest of the human population or the rest of the ideologies to make sure that your ideology is the one that has the most secure foothold to protect ourselves against the dangers of nature.
Right. So speaking as a longtime um, pug enthusiast, I don't think any other dog is as pure as pugs. So I've developed some sort of a virus that will kill every dog that's not a pug. Therefore, we can have a completely pure race of pugs, and with no chance of them being with them fraternizing with lower
Mm-hmm.
breeds,
Yep.
and that's going to go very well. I know.
Oh yeah, and part of the problem with that is, all right, you're breeding more pugs. Well, if you're going to continue to breed pugs the way that they have been bred, they're going to actually start suffocating to death on their tongues because
Mhm.
they're already choking to death on their tongues. So if you continue that line of breeding, they're going to start failing and die off. So I'm not saying that the result of culling to a single species or a single race is good, because the whole point of sexual reproduction is to keep variety in the gene pool
Mhm.
so that no one action or no one deformity, no one disease can wipe out the entirety of the species. So maintaining diversity in that to maintaining diversity is beneficial because it makes the species as a whole and life as a whole more resilient to individual points of failure against nature. So the the concept of saying let's only have one race is arguably not a valid thing to say, because you're losing redundancy against the troubles of nature. But an ideology that says one race is better because we can more medications can be made since we can focus it on just this one race, as opposed to needing to develop it for all different types of races. An argument can be made either way, but what you're saying is, I would, if you're eliminating everyone else except for your own race, what you're saying is, I would rather fight against nature with one race than combat nature and the other ideologies that go against me. And
Mhm.
that's an ethical stance. If you believe that it's better to just fight against nature, but with fewer points, a single point of failure, it's a risk that has to be taken, and it's a risk that has to be decided on from within that ethical system. But the whole idea of war that we're talking about is disagreeing ethical systems. So
Mhm.
the systems that you're fighting against are ones that say, no, we should actually have multiple races. We don't want to have a single race because then it's a single point of failure.
Mhm. Yeah. So is it? But yeah, getting back to the original conversation, because I think we are in agreement that diversity is definitely necessary to the survival of any species.
I don't think it's not necessarily necessary. I don't like the redundancy of that statement, but there are
It's
ethical
the most
systems where
effective path
light the
for
several
survival.
billion years of evolution have very clearly told us that diversity is critical to survival. That
Hmm.
the more types of beings you have, the more likely life is to go on. If you just have life on land and a meteor hits, you're going to lose a lot of that life. If you just
Hmm.
have life in water, if something affects ocean
Ocean,
going creatures,
yeah.
then like let's say there's a disease and you only have one body of water that life is in, then you could wipe out the entirety of life. So I think in
Hmm.
terms of preservation of life, having various types of life is beneficial. So having is extending that to races. Having a single race means a single point of failure, which according to nature, or at least nature is in a way telling us that's not good. Don't have a
Hmm.
single point of
Yeah.
failure.
Yep.
So, but again, that's an ethical argument from the
Hmm.
standpoint of nature.
So, yeah. So getting back to ethics of using non-human combatants in war. So
Let's just say robots. Let's skip drones.
yeah,
Let's say we have robots.
yeah. So we've got robots. Do you think that there's an ethical difference between a robot being controlled by a human, no matter how far away that is, maybe on the other side of the earth or maybe just a kilometer away? is there a difference between that or a robot that has been programmed and is fully autonomous to make decisions on its own and decide who is and who isn't combatants?
So
Or maybe a robot that
let,
is
let's
that
say
just
this. Let's simplify it. No one's
Mhm.
controlling the robot. The robot is smart, and I can say, go kill Muslims. And specifically, go kill Muslims that want to kill everyone else. And I can give them that command, and they will attempt to go do it. In a way, that's no different than throwing a rock. Because if I'm throwing a rock, I'm telling the rock, I want you to kill that person. It's the purpose behind throwing the rock. Telling a robot, I want you to go kill that person, is going to be significantly more effective, assuming that you have a robot that can, not
there
fall over, which we're
yeah.
still working on.
I mean, there is a difference here in that you like I'm gonna change your example a little bit and say that basically we drop a robot in a country and just says and we don't even say it, but like in its programming, it knows to kill anyone or stop anyone that is going to try to do harm to us or our country. So it makes decisions on its own. I don't think
Sure.
we need to involve religion or anything like that. If we drop it into a primarily Muslim country, you
Mm-hmm.
know what? It's probably going to target Muslims because
Sure.
that is who is in the country. But I don't think we need to say specifically like target
I,
Muslims that are
I,
going to hurt us. Just
I,
say target anyone that
I,
is.
I don't think it's any different. I think it's just a difference in the effectiveness. Say, because if I were operating, let's say our enemy is a very primitive culture. They use bow and arrows or bows and arrows and throw rocks, and we have snipers. That
Mhm.
it's going to be a very one-sided war, and we are telling the bullets, go kill them. We're going to be very effective at wiping them out, and we're saying our ideology says we need to kill you. Sending robots to do that is going to make us significantly more effective and successful in communicating that and eliminating that enemy ideology. And using more effective means doesn't change the motive. And I think that what's important here is the motive behind it. Are you willing to use a superior technology to eliminate another ideology? And if
Mhm.
you are, then it makes no difference what type of what type of technology that is, whether it be autonomous robots or bullets or rocks. The motive is what sets those things in motion, and that's what's important.
Mhm.
Because that's the whole basis of an ideological war is the ideologies.
So I think that there is a difference between firing a bullet at someone and telling a robot to go and target people that might fire
B-
a
b-
bullet at me.
because you're more likely to do that because it's the I'm not actually the one killing you. I'm just instructing someone else to kill
Mm.
you.
That and the decision ultimately with a bullet to kill someone is in on a human to make that decision. So you are choosing to fire a bullet at a person to
Every
kill
time
them.
someone dies, it's the direct choice of a person as opposed
Right.
to, hey, go kill a bunch of people. And then you find out maybe later, oh, I didn't mean for you to kill 25. I just wanted you to kill two.
Yeah. But because there was no one actually in control of the robot and it was acting within its programming, it killed a lot more people, or maybe not the people that you had intended to, because you didn't know exactly who you wanted
Mm-hmm.
to kill, but you knew, of certain factors, and nothing's perfect. So they make the wrong decisions. They kill maybe more people than you were expecting, or the wrong different people. But
So I think it
it
just
is not a direct action on your part that has killed those certain people. It is
but
a
it is. It would be
yeah.
the action of the person operating or communicating to whatever the AI is, and the fault of the programmers who were making it. And you're going to feel bad about killing someone in that way. If you had to strangle someone to death, so I'm going to give a couple examples of how you could kill someone. Strangle someone to death, stab them to death, shoot them to death, blow them up with a rocket launcher, or tell a robot to go kill them. Would you change the order in which I listed those if I asked you to sort them from most personally impacting to least? Because let me rephrase. I ordered those in such a way that I think strangling someone to death would be harder for me than stabbing someone to death. I think
it takes more
harder.
time. You see the suffering, and there's a lot longer where you are
Exactly.
directly exposed to what you're doing with a knife. If you may, like, you have after you start moving the knife towards someone, you have a split second to kind of
Change your mind.
wait, is this the right thing to do? And then even after, once it's entered into them, if if it was a good shot, even if you're like, oh no, I suddenly regret this, you can't really do much about it at this point.
Right.
Same with a bullet. You have less time to react after you've decided to pull the trigger.
Right.
And
Well,
then
you
with a
have no time
robot,
to react after you've pulled the trigger.
yeah, with a robot, you're separating yourself completely from the actual action. You can take a person and you can dehumanize them to just be
Yes.
the target. They
But
are not a human over there. They are the enemy, and I
but
don't
with
get to
guns, it's
see
the same
them.
thing. That oh, I've done target practice on this. That human is just a target.
Mm-hmm.
So I
But
think with every technological jump, and it's like literally as you move away from people in distance, and the less you see of people, the more dehumanized they are, and they're just a target, and it becomes easier to kill them. But
so is it
again,
ethical to dehumanize your
with better technology, it's easier to kill them.
enemy? Is it ethical to dehumanize your enemy in a war?
It depends on the ethical system that you're in. If you're in an ethical system that says you should feel the weight of loss of what you're doing, you should feel the things that you're doing, then you need to value life even when you're taking it. But if you say
Right.
you need to protect yourself so that you can move on and be an effective warrior, then you, to a degree, should dehumanize your enemy. So if you look at every single person that, if you're a soldier and you look at every single person that you kill and you learn about all of their families, you're much less likely to kill them, and you're much less likely to be an effective soldier, meaning you might lose the war. So to some degree, you have to be willing to kill someone. And in ideological warfare, where you're willing to kill them, you have to dehumanize to the point of being willing to kill. But if you dehumanize too much, then it becomes a war of extermination.
You don't need to dehumanize someone to kill them. You're
literally saying you don't deserve to be a human anymore.
You don't deserve to live anymore, but you are, like, you can kill someone completely believing that they are a human with their own life and their own, family and all of this going on, and still decide that they do not deserve to live anymore for one reason or another. So I would contend that there isn't a requirement to dehumanize your enemy when you are fighting them.
I think in the sense that I could define dehumanize as in to stop being human, I think that while after you're killed, you're still a human, but you aren't. Like,
you
as
are no
in,
longer living,
you
but
no longer
you're still a human.
No, I know you still are a human, but you no longer are. You don't exist anymore, or at least you aren't alive anymore, which means dehumanizing means they no longer exist as a living human being. So I think to some degree,
I don't agree with that definition. I would say dehumanizing is changing your perception or someone's perception of other humans so that they appear to be less than human. So
of how human they are.
Saying that that protesters are cockroaches, you are dehumanizing them. You are equating them to absolute pests and vermin that are regularly attempted to be exterminated.
Sure. I think the difference is that you can still value a human life and still eliminate that life because you value the lives of others. So if you view an ideology as enough of a threat to, you think that it will end up killing a particular person with an ideology may end up killing 5 people, and you want to stop that, so you end up killing them. You're not saying that they're less of a human, but that you value the lives of others more than you value the life of that particular person.
Or in a like self-defense scenario, someone is attacking you. You fight back and to save yourself, you end up needing to take their life. You
Hmm.
didn't say you're not a human, that's therefore I'm taking your life. Because there are many cases of someone killing another person in self-defense. They were right to do so because they would have died otherwise. But doesn't mean
They're
that
not dehumanizing
yeah,
the
they're going to
person that
be
they killed.
haunted. In many cases, they're haunted for the rest of their life about the fact that they took a life, even if it was to save their own or save someone else's. They had to take a life, and it is a real contributor to people having PTSD, to people having like being disturbed for the rest of their life because they know they did this to someone,
It
even though there was a logical reason to do it.
it's a weight that they have to carry with themselves because it's an active decision that had been made.
Right. And so extending that to warfare, the problem with separating people's responsibility and turning someone into a pure target in that you don't even see them, you don't see their face, you don't see them move, like in the event that
You
you're
see a statistic.
right, you if you aim a gun at someone, you are aiming a gun at someone, you see a human on the other end of that. And even if you are in a point of having that human dehumanized, you are still seeing a person, whether they're walking or sleeping or talking, whatever they're doing, you see a person. When
So
you are telling a robot to go kill someone, you don't see any of that, and it puts the person with the robots in the situation of, well, is it wrong?
we don't have to
Right,
worry about the emotional burden of the choices that we're
right.
making. So
And so we're going to be a lot more likely to go to war rather than try to work things out peacefully.
mhm.
If I can just kill a general of another country very quickly and very easily, versus if I have that option versus maybe 3 months of um, going and having discussions with them and debating and trying to come up with some sort of
Politics,
yeah, going through the whole politics route.
killing someone versus
Um,
finding a political agreement,
yeah,
it may
like
just be easier to kill them, but you
right,
have to
and
live with that
in many
decision.
cases it is. And so, but when you say you have to live with that decision, if you do it so that no you nor anyone really is directly responsible to the point that they would feel the emotional weight of the action, it puts us in a world where there's going to be a lot more death and there's going to be a lot less um, discourse about things. And that's where I go into saying that the ethics of robotic warfare, of drone warfare, of that separation, it is a lot less ethical than having direct human on human conflict, because you are removing your the emotional burden that comes with a war, and thus making war more likely to happen.
So I think I have a perfect example to bring up here. In Star Trek, the original series, there was an episode called A Taste of Armageddon. And this is kind of the extreme of what we've been discussing here. Basically, what they had is two factions, a planet where there were two factions, and they never actually were at war with each other. They had set up simulations based on the technology that they had, and a simulated attack would take place. They would determine what the loss of life would be, and they're not humans, but um, they were sentient beings, and each member of these species, if they say there were 2 million people that died, 2 million people would then go to incinerators and just kill themselves. They would be removed painlessly, so it was ethical from the perspective of eliminating pain that people felt. The resources, like cities, weren't destroyed, so you could go on living in those cities. You could focus your resources on continuing to supply for the people that remained, and it was just an ongoing war where only lives were lost and not resources or quality of life. And you didn't feel pain in the death. You didn't have to waste time with fighting people. It was just simulated. But there was still loss of life.
Mhm. So I think that is the extreme of two sides agreeing that there's going to be robotics or a simulation that's going to control this. I think that is a lot more ethical than having one side use the advanced technology or the robots to kill people on the other side.
Where if both sides are agreeing to have a simulated war but have it be actual deaths, that is more ethical than a single side saying this is the ideology we follow.
I would say that it's more ethical than having one side with no potential, or like basically
No
no
choice in the
potential of
matter.
lives lost, and no, yeah, one side has no choice in the matter, and the other side has basically all of the power in that they can wage a war without putting their own lives or their own emotional states at risk.
So I think that claim that you just made, that it's more ethical to have two sides be evenly matched versus one side, makes the assumption that having a variety of ethical systems is better, that you should allow both ethical systems to have it out,
Mhm.
um, versus one ethical system just wipe the floor with another. In terms of survival of the fittest, the system that makes you most likely to survive is what should be most prevalent because it preserves life. Again, assuming that life is your goal of what you want to preserve. So, elongating a war because the two sides are very evenly matched means that in the long run, you'll probably end up having a larger loss of life than the short burst loss of life, like what we saw at the end of World War II in Japan. So,
I mean,
having a
just
decisive. Go ahead.
I was going to say, just because you have a significant advantage doesn't mean that you aren't, um, you have taken yourself out of being at risk or feeling the pain or the emotional pain
Sure.
after the fact of what you're doing.
Well, also, having a technological advantage does not equate to having an ethical advantage.
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
you
So
can
it
have a
is
terrible
there.
ideology, but if you have a terrible ideology that makes nukes, uh, you're going to be effective in war.
Right. And so you are like, if we are going to be, if we're fighting a war of ethics, it should be fought on an ethical playground, or an ethical war situation where it is a battle of ethics. It shouldn't matter how advanced your technology is. It should matter, are you like, if you take the two leaders of two movements and you put them into a room where they can have an ethical discussion about which is better and which is worse until they come to an agreement. I
That's
mean, that
that's
is
a war on ethic. An ethical war. I don't think
a
so.
war
Not
of
not at
ethics.
all. I think the point of what is an ethical war? An ethical war is, well, sorry, a war of ethics is saying our ideology is better than your ideology. When you get to the point where you're willing to kill the opposition, that's what an ideological war is. And when you have failed to resolve your differences, or even if you haven't tried, but if differences are not being resolved through discussion, then the ethical system that says, I am willing to kill to protect my ethical system, that willingness is inherent in the ethical system that you're defending. That killing, going to war means you're killing. And regardless of what your ethics are, the ability to kill must be represented in it. Even if it's
Mhm.
just for the protection of your ethical system, you can ethically kill people because you're trying to preserve the system. And any system that is willing to kill to preserve the ethical system means that killing can be justified from within that ethical system. Again, I think the difficulty here is we're talking about meta ethics, that we're talking
Mhm.
about two types of ethics or two moral systems struggling with each other and killing each other. But if they're willing to kill each other, then killing is acceptable in both systems.
Mhm.
So,
So in a situation where one culture has decided that it is ethically right to use eugenics to um and eugenics and just genetic modification to enhance their people so much so that they've become way more technologically
yep,
advanced than another culture. Now,
two.
if they then decide to wipe out that other culture, then the you're telling me that it is because their ethics told them that it was okay to genetically enhance themselves and thus give them a major advantage.
If
Therefore, they deserve to win.
I think that from a neutral perspective, or at least from a natural perspective, survival of the fittest reigns supreme. So if you follow an ethical structure that says gene manipulation is acceptable, not just eugenics, but that we can manipulate genes and that that's okay, you're taking on a lot of risks in manipulating genes, and you're likely to mess it up. But if you take that risk, if you view it as ethically acceptable to take that risk, and you're successful in it, then you are more capable. It means that you can manipulate your genes to be able to make you more or less effective, or more or less susceptible to particular environmental inputs. You are better able to face natural challenges. You are more fit to survive from a naturalistic perspective, meaning that whatever you decide to do, you have survivability on your side. Now, the people that you're trying to eliminate would contest that and say, no, just because you are less likely to get diseased doesn't mean that you have the right to kill us. And so they'll fight back with their own ethical system, saying, I am okay with killing you because you're trying to eliminate me. That's the aspect of the ethical system that enables the defending group to kill the offending group, is because you're trying to eliminate us. That is not acceptable from within our ethical system, so we're going to fight back. And then they'll have it out of, if you're within that ethical system, but that ethical system has led you to a point where you can't defend yourself against genetically modified beings, well, you aren't as able to defend yourself. And as from natural law, or the law, like the law of nature, survival of the fittest, then yes, the group that did gene manipulation to get to the point where they can kill everyone else, that is, they are supported in the natural sense. Now, whether or not they will be successful in that endeavor, in getting to the point where they're superior compared to everyone else, that's a completely different question. I think that the more you try to gain an advantage and use lethal means, the more you're likely to have issues with it. I think Russia and Chernobyl is a great example of that. They're trying to use an energy source, not necessarily to kill people, but they were developing nuclear weapons, and along that, they were using the same materials to build nuclear power plants. That went horribly, horribly wrong when Chernobyl exploded, and people died. So there is risk associated with higher levels of power. Putting a stone together with a stick doesn't carry with it that much risk. Using nuclear technology carries a lot of risk because of the radiation. So I think the higher degree of power that you're trying to harness for the purpose of warfare, the more likely you are to mess things up for yourself. But if you're able to be successful in it, then you've proven yourself worthy to be able to use that technology against those that can't use that technology, because you are more likely to survive whatever nature can throw at you because of what you've learned.
Yeah. And I mean, from a completely neutral perspective, not factoring in, not using it, not taking a third party's bias into fact, you are right. That's just not really possible for any third party not to enter in some sort of bias.
Oh, sure. And other parties will go in. So if let's say we have, in that example, we have genetically modified individuals that have superior intellect and superior strength, and they start trying to kill everyone else. But everyone else on the planet, not just a particular. So, man, this is going to be a weird example. Let's say you have genetically modified Nazis that want to kill the Jews. If everyone else on the planet says, hey, we don't necessarily agree with the Jews and their opinions, but it's not okay to do what you're doing, we're all going to fight against you. The genetically modified Nazis are much more likely to lose because they are defending an ideology that is viewed as unacceptable by all other ideologies. So you need to take into account not just the ideology that you're fighting against, but if other ideologies would be willing to kill you defending the ideology that you're targeting.
I mean, that works to an extent, I think. I mean, if the gain of some technology or this genetic enhancement, or let's say um, the let's say these genetically modified Nazis aren't only genetically modifying themselves, but they've genetically modified a virus that will kill everyone unless they have been genetically modified by the
Mm-hmm.
Nazis. Therefore, everyone but the Nazis are going to just die. There is no everyone on Earth would potentially just die from that,
Mm-hmm.
and it wouldn't. We no longer have there wouldn't be the ability for all the other countries to say, "Hey, stop that! Stop
So
doing that!"
yeah,
It
yeah,
just happens.
they don't have the chance to be able to have it out. So let's say that happens. The likelihood that something goes wrong in that process and the virus actually also infects the genetically modified Nazis is fairly high. And since you now have a single point of failure, it's
Mhm.
actually pretty likely that nature at some point will wipe them out. So let's say that there's an ethical system or a group that ends up getting a massive advantage. I guess nuclear warfare, perfect example. And mutually assured destruction. Let's say nukes started flying and we killed ourselves off. A lot of
Mhm.
people would say, well, you could say, we had it coming. We get our just desserts, and that's what we deserve. If we can't exist, and if we can't coexist in such a way that we don't end up killing ourselves, then we don't deserve, from a natural perspective, to keep living. That if, and even if it's just one moral structure that permitted the death of everyone. So let's say a group decides we're going to create a virus that kills everyone except for ourselves, and they mess it up. They decide we're going to try this. They mess it up and they kill everyone. Everyone else is also at fault to a degree because they permitted a moral structure that allowed for what brought the end of the species.
Mhm.
So, in other words, if you view genetic engineering as not okay because of the dangers that's associated with it, and you see someone doing it, and they're doing it on human research, and you think you might be a risk to the species, but you don't go to war with them or you don't physically stop them from doing it, and then they end up killing everyone, you had an obligation to protect the species from those dangers, and you didn't act on them. And
Mhm.
therefore, that moral system was not resilient enough to prevent against that problem. And so while it died off and everyone died off, that moral system wasn't resilient enough to survive. And from a natural perspective, if you aren't resilient enough to survive within nature, you don't deserve to survive. And even if it wasn't your moral structure that led to the disintegration of the species, your moral structure was such that it permitted those other dangerous moral structures to exist. Now, that being said, having a moral structure where people that disagree with you must be eliminated or people that take high risks must be
Mhm.
eliminated because it's a danger to the species, that is itself a moral structure that has its own dangers because you're just going to go wiping out everyone that disagrees with you.
Yeah.
So every moral structure has risks. Every ethical structure has risks. Removing the weight of loss of life modifies that moral structure. It
Mhm.
modifies how that moral structure interacts with and combats with other moral structures and other ethical structures. But whichever ethical structure is most successful in preserving life and
Mhm.
asserting itself over other moral structures that threaten life, that's going to be the most successful. Not just the ones that are resilient towards nature, but also resilient towards ethical structures that are not conducive to the preservation of life.
Mhm.
So let's apply what we were just discussing then to the episode of Taste of Armageddon. You have two moral structures, both of which say we'll just eliminate ourselves but allow simulations to move forward.
Mhm.
In that case, I think that let's say the simulation said everyone dies.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people would go forward with it, but some people would say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not just going to go and die. We're going to fight for our lives.
Mhm.
And there would be people on both of those sides in those two factions that would say, we're going to start fighting for our lives. And in that case, you would go to a more traditional war where you're actively killing people. And I think that the more abstract type of conflict that you have,
Mhm.
the more likely you are to engage in warfare. But when you get to the point of, let's say, just robots fighting robots, then it's more of who's building the better robots and how far are they willing to go, as well as who has the most resources. But if you get to the point where, all right, they ran out of resources to build their robots, well, I guess that means we win. If the country or if the group that's defending and saying, well, we don't have the resources to make robots is still willing to start throwing people at the problem and say, we are willing to die for it, then human life starts coming back into the question. And if the people using the robots against humans say, we're not willing to do that because it's unfair, we don't want to wipe you out, we want to convince you, then you may be more likely to stop using as effective of means. But again, it just really depends on the moral structure of who's defending and who's attacking and what can you deem as acceptable from within your moral structure. How effective of weapons are you willing to use? And at least over the past 75 years since a nuke was used, most of the world has said, we're not okay with using this. We've come really close.
Yeah. The doomsday clock was quite close to midnight for a long time.
Yeah. So we've come very, very close to using nukes again, but it's something that as a whole, while we have many different moral structures and many different ideologies, we have pretty much all agreed we don't want to use nukes right now because it's too effective. So while we have different moral structures, there's a shared moral structure where we say it's not okay to just have everyone die. And I think that as long as that is maintained and mutually assured destruction is maintained of it's not okay to put everyone at risk and kill everyone, we need to avoid having that type of war. And if that's a moral structure that is sustainable in the long run, even with variations of that moral structure arguing with each other, I think that no matter how effective the moral structures are that are combating each other, so no matter, even if two sides will always disagree, if they aren't so effective that they wipe out the species or wipe out all moral structures, it means that some moral structures will continue to exist and be able to assert themselves against the neutral cruelty that is nature. As long as a moral structure exists, then there is some validity to the moral structure that permitted the species to exist in the first place or maintain existence. This is super naturally reductionist, but that's kind of the point of this podcast, is to get to that point of reductionism. So again, there are more. We're talking about moralities and metamoralities of two moral structures arguing it out. What is the most moral way to do that? It depends on the moral structure that you're in, and I think that from a natural perspective and a neutral perspective, the most likely to survive moral structure is a moral structure that permits other moral structures to exist because you gain the benefit of all the redundancies. That having a variety of moral structures is good. So wiping out moral structures is bad, meaning that wars of extermination are bad, but wars asserting themselves over other moral structures without completely eliminating all of those ideologies and just integrating the good parts is probably going to be the most successful. But that doesn't mean that it is actually the one that's most successful. It just is a different likelihood of successfulness.
Yeah. So you're saying it is ethically right to try to integrate the best of all ethical stances into one massive meta ethic.
I think if you're looking at a natural argument, having variety is important. That life is more likely to go on if there is variety in the types of life.
Mm-hmm.
If you extend that to morality, the more types of morality you have, the more likely you are to be able to preserve the entities that hold that morality. If you have a moral structure that ends up devolving into just a murderous riot and everyone kills themselves, then you didn't have a successful moral structure. So there are moralities that are more successful than others, and you can have them be differently successful. Eliminating moral structures in that regard is bad unless those moral structures lead to destructive ends.
Mm-hmm.
But also, moral structures, again, from that perspective, moral structures that eliminate other moral structures just because they disagree are also bad. So you can't, while preserving other moral structures is good, you don't want to preserve moral structures that say the preservation of moral structures is good. Again, this is just everything on moral battles.
Yeah. So I think we're kind of coming to the logical conclusion of this.
I think so. It's I think it can be at least partially boiled down to war is when a moral structure gets to the point of saying it is acceptable to kill people based on another ideology or another group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not that's ethical has to do with your perception on how moral structures should debate with each other, how many moral structures there should be, and what your ideology is. And what your ideology is dependent on what side of the war you're on. So I don't think that you can say whether or not war is ethical or removing the risk of loss of life is ethical, because war, by definition, is where you're willing to cause people or entities to lose their lives. So I think that it sounds to me like the question that we asked at the very beginning of what are the ethics of removing life from warfare? It makes it not a war. It makes it an argument.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, if you remove the loss of life on either side, on both sides.
If you remove the loss of life on both sides,
the potential for loss of life on a single side, you're in a situation where that one side kind of has complete control and could effectively wipe out that other side without ever putting themselves at risk.
And then I think the question then becomes not is it ethical as a whole, it's just does the system that's doing the killing permit for wiping out a group of people or wiping out an ideology? Because if it's viewed as acceptable, as morally acceptable to wipe out an ideology, then yes, it is acceptable to remove loss of life from your own side, and it's good. If wiping out an ideology is viewed as not morally acceptable, then from within that structure, it's not acceptable. So I think that it's entirely dependent on what moral structure you come from. If the answer to the question, is it okay to stop an ideology from existing, or a particular ideology from existing? So if you ask a soldier, is it okay to eliminate Muslim extremism? If the answer to that is yes, then no matter how you do it, it's moral.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there may be subtext to that of you shouldn't be torturing them and we can kill them without torturing them, therefore it's still ethical or it's still valid within our ethical system. But I think it just comes down to the individual moral structure. Preservation of your moral structure is something that is pretty dominant in all moral structures. Even if some permit torture, some do not, but I think almost all moral structures want to preserve themselves. So it is necessary to preserve as many of the people with your own moral structure as possible, or at least the goal of the moral structure is to preserve as many people that hold that moral structure. So reducing the loss of life on your side to as high of a degree as possible is most likely is the way that most likely preserves your moral structure and is therefore valid. So I think that under the assumption that moral structures want to preserve themselves through time, it is always moral to act in such a way that it preserves your moral structure. And the way that you do that is by minimizing deaths on one side, meaning that to a degree, in most moral structures, I would argue, by that argument, it is acceptable to be able to overpower an enemy in war.
So, I mean, a lot of your argument goes into the fact that reducing the amount of lives lost on your side or on either side, really as a whole, is going to be the best possible outcome, and it's going to allow the most ethical side to win.
A moral structure to
And
continue, just to rephrase what you're saying, a moral structure that wants to continue existing needs to have people that hold that moral structure. So preserving the lives of people that hold that moral structure is the best way for it to preserve itself.
So, sitting in a position where I think the majority of moral structures in the world, and this is, I'm going to say majority, or the majority, maybe not the structures, but the majority of people have a moral structure along the lines of death is like taking a human life is bad, and it is better to preserve human life whenever possible.
And that's
I do mean whenever
that's
possible.
that's something that is shared in many moral structures.
Yeah.
But it's still a moral opinion, and it's a I guess a subset of a moral superstructure.
Correct. And I think it is entirely dependent on your moral structure whether or not it is acceptable. And so you answering yes to the fact that it is acceptable to use drones and remove the loss of life on your own side, no matter what the loss of life is on the other side, is entirely whether that's yes or no a is completely dependent on your own moral
It's
structure
a
and your own morals and
sure
your ethics.
it's a logical and it's a standpoint of I'm saying that natural logic is important. So making that statement assumes that natural logic is a valid way to interpret morality, which is a moral opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So
And I'm just
making that
and
claim requires a moral structure itself.
right, correct. And so from my point of view, my moral structure and what makes logical sense to me based on my own ethics
Mm-hmm.
is that by removing the loss of life on your own side, on one side, and removing also the emotional weight that comes with taking life,
Mm-hmm.
no matter whose that life was, it could
Mm-hmm.
have been a rapist or a serial killer or just your enemy that was trying to kill you. No matter what, there is always going to be something wrong, or in my opinion there's always something wrong with that. There are a lot of reasons why it needs to be acceptable in certain
You
situations, but that doesn't
you
take away the emotional weight that comes with taking a life.
you hold the moral belief, or at least you're coming from the perspective that
Mm-hmm.
feeling the loss of life is important because it makes you less likely to kill other people, which means that
Correct.
you're more likely to preserve life, which is also
Right.
a
And
logical
so
standpoint. However,
right.
from if you're in a moral structure that says fast action needs to be taken because in
Mm-hmm.
nature you may need to make life and death decisions very, very, very quickly. Holding that emotional burden makes you less likely to act, which can be
Right.
both a good thing and a bad thing.
Or act in a different way. So in the sense of someone has threatened to kill you and they are on their way to your house right now to kill you.
They
You
are?
have sure. Um let's finish this and I'll get in my car.
Okay.
Um, they have threatened this. You completely believe that they are on their way to kill you right now.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can either just load your gun and be waiting for them,
Mm-hmm.
or you can take a route that's going to be less likely to um, result in any death. Now,
It may give
if
that person time to cool down, and no
yeah,
one may end up dying.
or like yeah, or you set up in a way, or you have it so that if they once they enter your house to kill you, you're not there, but suddenly they are trapped in your house,
Yep.
such that they're there, they have time to think. Maybe you call the cops and say, hey, this person tried to murder me, or tried to like they threatened to kill me, came to my house, they're locked in the house right now, please
Sure.
come get them out of my house.
Sure. There are different ways
And
of handling the
yeah,
situation.
and so you might take the quick action of, oh, they threatened to kill me, I'm actually going to drive to their house real quick and take them out before I know they can take me out, type of thing. But if you are in that situation, it is there it's not just a, well, I should kill them before they kill me. It is, how is it morally acceptable if there is another way where neither of us is at risk of death, or I have
Sure.
minimized the risk of death?
But if I see and from a different moral perspective, if I see someone that is willing to kill me, from my perspective, it may be valid to say they don't. If they're willing to kill because they just dislike me,
Mhm.
they don't have a right to exist from within my moral structure. I'm not saying that that is my opinion. I'm saying that that is a type of moral opinion that could be held. So in that case, it's perfectly moral to kill that person because you're trying to defend your own moral structure. So
Mm.
I guess what it comes down to is, as moral structures are combating each other, the only way to tell which one is most valid is to see which one lives or is most successful. And when those moral structures meet to the point where people are willing to kill each other, regardless of how you kill each other, the moral structure needs to play itself out to decide whether or not it's moral.
Should moral structures be fall under the sense of the natural selection sense? Should this concept, this non corporeal thing, fall under the same rules as natural selection? Fall under those rules? Because to like moral structures aren't, I would argue, are not a natural phenomena. They don't exist without
we are nature. We
we.
are a component of nature, and therefore we arose from nature. Assuming that you hold the belief that humans evolved from other forms of life and weren't created by some deity. So I don't think it is possible to determine
So
what is an. Go
like
ahead.
let's simplify this down to everyone in the world has, let's just say, I'm going to make the assumption, and I know it's not entirely true, that everyone in the world has a favorite color.
Okay.
And for one reason or another, we come into a situation where everyone is so hell bent on their favorite color that anyone that does not share that favorite color deserves to die.
Yep.
Now, if everyone that loves the color blue kills everyone else, or they are the only surviving ones after this war of color, is blue the best color?
It would be the new overarching favorite color of everyone.
But does that mean it's the best color? Because no matter what, it comes still down to personal belief, personal
Not
opinion.
necessarily
It
that
does
blue is
not
the
mean
best
it's the best.
color. It means that people who like blue are the most successful and most able to
Mhm.
assert their their moral ideals over others, which means that they are more resilient. So people that like blue are the most deserving to live from a
Okay,
natural
so
perspective.
someone,
Again, from the
so
perspective of natural morality of
mhm.
survival of the
I
fittest, if blue ends
natural
up winning out,
morality is a term that I do not like.
okay. I'm saying
um,
from survival of the fittest,
mhm.
whoever, if you can kill other people, okay, you're most fit to survive. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will continue to survive with that ideology. But in terms of Who is most capable of killing others? That
I'm just saying that moral arguments and belief systems should not be deemed valid solely based on the physical or technological prowess of those who hold said beliefs.
I would agree with that. I think that moral beliefs or moral validity comes from the ability of a moral system to extend itself and continue existing into the future. And in order to continue existing, it will need to be able to evolve and change with nature, or lead to a point where it can control nature so that it doesn't have to change, but also deal with other moral systems. So the moral system that is most capable of interacting with other moral systems while preserving itself is the one most worth preserving. And if that moral structure happens to include defending itself through means of war by any means necessary, including not needing to kill other people, or not needing to sacrifice your own lives and just eliminating other lives, sure. I guess what our answer seems to be boiling down to in terms of, is it ethical to wipe out another ideology? It comes down
It
to,
depends on who you are.
it depends on who you are, and it depends on what you view as the goal of an ideology. If you think that the goal of an ideology is to preserve itself into the future, then whatever ideology is most capable of doing that is the most valid. If you think that it's okay to wipe out other ideologies, that may not be a stable structure and it may end up getting wiped out. If you think that if maybe you have a very successful ideology that says it's not okay to, let's say, use robots to just go out and kill people because I want to feel bad about when I kill, you're less able to defend yourself, and you may end up being overrun by a morality that says that it is okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that is a good way to end this, because
I think so, because we've been bouncing around for the past half hour on meta moralities and meta ethics, and it's not an easy topic, but
yeah,
it isn't, and it never has been. War in that regard never changes. Well, I think we've battled it out enough. Anything else you want to add?
No, not right now.
All right. Well, it's been a heavy topic, everyone. Thanks for listening. Let us know what you agree or disagree with us in the comments. If you can, let us know what timestamp you're referring to, because we covered a lot of things, a lot of difficult and complex topics here. So let us know what you think, and we'll see you guys next time.
Everyone, thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.